Ladies and gentlemen, if I could just have everyone's attention. Good morning, everyone. Sorry. Just to highlight, there's a counter on the screen here for when we'll start our live stream in about 4 minutes. So if everybody would like to grab their coffees and take a seat, that would be great. Thank you. Huh? Good morning, everyone. Richard. Everyone's attention. Thank you, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Excited to welcome this morning. It's so in person speaking. Some people haven't had much opportunity to get back and do things in the room on the back of COVID. So great to see so many of you here this morning. And I know we're joined by another 20, 25 people who are joining us from the comfort of their office or their living room. So to award. Do you want to swap? Let's just pause whilst we get that sorted. Is that better? Is that better? Can everybody hear okay now? Lovely. Okay, perfect. Gone again, Richard, I think. Those days. Can I just check? Is everybody okay? Perfect. Right, let's start that again. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all. I just wanted to say thank you, actually, as well. I know everyone's extremely busy, coming off the back of the pandemic, going headlong into the cost of living crisis. I know all of you have so many things that you're managing from an organisational perspective, a work perspective, family life. So just thank you all very much for taking the time to come and join us this morning. We've got such a wide range of organisations in the room, from parish councils through to large multi-million-pound charitable organisations. So we always try and achieve something that's relevant to you all, and I very much hope that we're able to do that today. For those of you who've not met me before, just making sure the slides match, they do, that's great. My name is Lexi Shore. I'm managing partner at AC Mole, but it's also my pleasure to head up our charities team. And I know, let's get a little show of hands. There's quite a few of the team, they're ignoring me at the back of the room there. Good morning. So I'm really, really pleased to be joined by so many from my team here today as well. They're a great bunch of people. And do save all your tricky questions for them, if that's all right, the ones at the back. But no, head up our charities team, and it's our pleasure to organisations across the whole of the Southwest. In terms of our agenda for today, we've got some really fantastic items, actually. Really pleased with some of the speakers we've got joining us today. I'm afraid, with an apology, you've got me to start, so I hope you're all topped up on tea and coffee. And I couldn't start anywhere other than setting the scene and talking a little bit about what's going on in the wider economic environment as well. So we're going to start with that. Sarah and I are then going to do a joint session around people, the importance of people in the sector, and Sarah's going to do a piece on ESG. We then got Becky Aldridge, who's Chief Executive of Dorset Mental Health Forum. And Becky is going to join us and talk a little bit about the forum, but also some of her experience in leading that organisation as well. They do some really fantastic work, so really looking forward to hearing from Becky this morning. Then got a break for coffee and networking. We will try and keep roughly with the agenda, because obviously we are live streaming as well as doing it in the room, so we'll aim to keep on time as much as we can. After coffee, as a change to our original schedule, we did have an investment advisor speaking, but unfortunately they had a family bereavement this week. So my huge thanks goes to Durgan for stepping in at the last minute and joining us and agreeing to present this morning. So Durgan's going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity and how relevant that is for charities. And I know, again, off the back of the pandemic, so many organisations are moving to doing more things digitally. And it's just making sure that your security and your systems and controls are keeping up with that pace of change, so that information, that data is kept securely. So Durgan's going to talk to that for about 20 minutes or so. Then Sarah's going to give us a technical update and take any Q&As and hot topics in the sector. And then we've got a break for lunch, which I hope you'll be able to stay on and join us for. So a pretty full agenda this morning, and looking forward to running through that. So setting the scene, I guess. I couldn't really, as I said, start anywhere else. It's such unusual times that we're going through at the moment. So many challenges coming off the back of the cost of living crisis. And that crisis is having impact in so many different ways. And it felt almost naive to kind of start off talking about the state of the sector and hot topics if we weren't pausing and taking a breath and looking at that environment in which all of our organisations are operating, but all of our beneficiaries are, it's relevant to all of them as well as to our volunteers. I am also an accountant,
So it comes with an apologies. I do like looking at the numbers and the economy and what's going on. So apologies in advance for that. But I do think it's really relevant to talk about that and the state of the sector at the moment. Before doing that, I just wanted to get, and I'm very happy to take questions. If you've got questions, put your hand up and stuff as I'm going through. But just wanted to ask questions. Has anyone got any idea how many voluntary organisations there actually are in England and Wales? Anybody like to take a guess? Any thoughts? Any takers?
Charities is about 13,000.
Yeah, so well, by the time you look at voluntary organisations, there's 165,000 voluntary organisations in England and Wales. And of those, what percentage do you think have income under 100,000? Very good, yeah, 80%, well done, full marks. So yeah, we've got 165,000 voluntary organisations in England and Wales, and over 80% of those have income under 100,000. And essentially, I think that's really important when you're then thinking about the sector as a whole. We've got a lot of small organisations here. We've got a lot of grassroots organisations that are doing a lot of work in their local area, and that's really important when you think about the sector as a whole, as to thinking about how it's made up. The charities with income over £1 million, which are considered to be major charities, they actually comprise less than 5%, by way of numbers, of voluntary sectors. So there's always that perception of these big charities because we hear about them all the time. But actually, in terms of the sector as a whole, they make up a relatively small proportion. I think it's just a really important context to have when thinking about the charitable and voluntary sector as a whole. Moving on from that then, I wanted to start, you can't really start anywhere else at the moment, inflation. And don't worry if you can't see the slides, it's not about seeing the detail, it's about kind of seeing the trends, and I'll talk to them. And we will send the slide packed around after as well. But this is inflation. This is where we stand. So inflation to November 22 was 11.1%. And the Bank of England's forecast for next year is that it's going to peak at around 13% later this year, and average around 7.4% next year. And you can see how different that is. This chart goes back to 2009. The forecast, the yellow line at the bottom, was actually what the OBR thought it was going to be in October 21, which was less than 4%. And here we are now at 11%. And I actually had a meeting with the Bank of England and the Monetary Policy Committee last week, and they were talking about their forecast into next year. And my question was, well, how reliable are those? How confident are you in those forecasts? And they admitted that there's a really high degree of uncertainty around that at the moment. Who can predict what's going to happen in Ukraine? Who can predict what's going to happen with energy prices and how those factor into the economy as a whole? So some real challenges around those forecasts. But one thing that is certain is that high inflation is here to stay. This is not going to go away anytime soon. And that's going to really present some challenges in a number of different ways. I'm going to touch on some of those this morning. Now, you might be sat here thinking, well, okay, inflation, what can I do about that? Well, you can't do a great deal about it, absolutely not. But the point is about understanding the impact that that's going to have on your organisation, about understanding the impact that's going to have on your beneficiaries, your staff, your volunteers. And so that's what I wanted to talk about this morning. What I thought I'd do, though, this was my slide from last year. So I thought, actually, where were we last year when we talked about this? So this is my slide from last year. And you can see, as I mentioned, so back in March 21, which wasn't that long ago, the OBR was forecasting inflation would be 1.5%, and then it increased a little bit. And last year, when I was still doing exactly the same presentation, their forecast was, oh, it's going to be much higher. It's going to get to 4.4% this year. So you can see how much that's shifted and how much uncertainty there is at the moment. So setting the scene then, the cost of living crisis. Inflation is now at a 40-year high. 77% of people are worried about the rising costs as a result of the cost of living crisis. 43% of people are finding it difficult to pay their energy bills, and 30% of people are finding it difficult to pay their mortgage and their rent. And this is something that's going to be here to stay. A lot of people are really starting to feel the pinch. And as everyone knows, everyday goods are now far more expensive than they were. This is a diagram actually from July 22, so it's already out of date, but this is the year-on-year increase in some of our basic goods. So low-fat milk, I don't know why it was low-fat as opposed to full-fat, perhaps that's more expensive, but low-fat milk was up 34%. Flour, and therefore bread, up 30%. Frozen food, and I think actually the worst, I think it made the headlines, Heinz tomato ketchup, I think was 53%, whatever reason that was. But basically, basic goods are increasing. And again, you might think, well, why is this relevant? Why does this make any difference? Well, for those low-income households, these are staple goods. Dairy, bread, these are things that are essential purchases. These are not things that they can change in terms of their spending profile. So this level of increase year on year is really adding to the pinch in some of these places. Just getting a little bit of feedback on the mic. Sorry. We'll have another little tweak with our setup. Is everyone still able to hear it all right at the back? Lovely, good. Okay, we'll see if we can get that feedback sorted. So continuing then to set the scene, again, don't worry about the detail of the chart, but this shows basically growth in household income over a 10-year period. And apologies, I did say I was an accountant, so we're going to get a few numbers, but it is really relevant in terms of setting the scene. This line here, this is 30%. This was the average growth in real terms in household incomes between 1966 and 2008. So over a 10-year period, you were seeing 30% growth in household incomes. That's now fallen as a result of the financial crisis in 2008, and it's now hovering at 5%. So that's a 30% increase down to a 5% increase. And as you can see from the chart, that actually income is now forecast to reduce in real terms in 2024, and wages are expected to fall by 2.2%. So you've got increasing costs of basic goods. You've got increasing pressures and decreasing income in real term. So some real challenges here when you look at inflationary rises, but also income on a household level. As a result of that, the forecasts are that living standards are going to drop by 7% next year. And there will be more than 500,000 more people unemployed. Now, I don't know, I'm a bit of a skeptic sometimes. I must admit, I look back to that forecast from last year when we said inflation was going to be 4.4%, and I thought, I remember thinking at the time, I think that's optimistic. I think some of these are optimistic as well in terms of the impact this could have on unemployment into the future. But obviously we should wait to see. But some really stark contrasts there between that 30%, that was the average to the end of 2008, and where we are now in terms of household incomes. Again, another chart, but this is showing savings by household based on relative income levels. So this top line, the pink line here, that's the households in the lowest 1/5 in terms of their income level. And the interesting figure here is this one. It's that 50% of households in the lowest 1/5 of income have savings of less than £1,000. That's 50% of households. And for those organisations that are dealing with beneficiaries, that are helping people that are in those lower socioeconomic backgrounds, these are the people that we're talking about. These are the people that are facing 30% increases in their basic goods on a day-to-day basis. There is no safety net there for these households. So if your charity is helping these people, if you're supporting these people, understanding this environment couldn't be more important in terms of the impact it's going to be having on your beneficiaries at the moment. So it would be fair to say the Chancellor had a little bit on his hands when it came to the autumn statement. He had a few challenges to deal with. He did, as you'll have seen, increase the minimum wage, which would impact those of you who are employers and have anyone on minimum wage, but also helpful for those households that are on minimum wage. So that was a welcome increase. And also committed to increasing benefits and pensions in line with inflation. Again, really helpful for those households that are reliant on those incomes. The expected spending cuts to public services were delayed. They may still come, but they're not coming yet, so they haven't been announced yet. And there were some real-term increases to spend for the NHS, for the education and social care. And for those of you that work within that sector or who provide services within that sector, again, really, really welcome news in terms of hopefully the funding for those sectors continuing, at least at equivalent levels. The statement itself, however, ran to 70 pages, and there wasn't a single mention of the word charity in there. And in the accompanying speech, there was nothing around civil society and the role that it has to play at the moment. And that came as quite a shock to many in the sector when you reflect on the situation we are in at the moment and the importance of charitable and voluntary organisations in supporting individuals at the moment. It was noticeable by its absence. And there was also no new investment in the sector itself either. Other things just to highlight, we talked around the discount on energy bills. For organisations, that runs till March 2023. There's no further clarity as to what will happen past that date at the moment. The Chancellor has said he recognises the need for further support, but that will be on a significantly lower scale and targeted at those organisations that need it most. You may remember there was a reduction to the foreign aid budget to 0.5% that was announced as a temporary measure off the back of COVID. That again wasn't mentioned, so it's here to stay for the time being at least. Last year he did say 2024-25, that might increase back up, but there hasn't been much more on that, so we'll wait and see. But the response to the sector, I think, there was obviously quite a lot in the media, feedback to the budget, never particularly positive. But I think it would be fair to say that the sector itself felt a little bit left out as a result of the lack of any commentary around it. There were some very interesting quotes, actually. The civil society said a lot of charities were forced to spend their reserves to get through the pandemic. And they're now facing compounding demands and buckling under the pressure of these demands to support individuals and organisations at the moment. The Charity Tax group said that the support that charities give to society at the moment is critical, and that it was worrying that there was no recognition of that at all in the statement, no mention of it. When you think of the context of the environment we're operating, it is kind of interesting that there was nothing at all. And CAF said that basically charities have been at the front line of the cost of living crisis, helping individuals, helping beneficiaries with that need. So it's disappointing that there was no support for charities in that context. They also asked for a bit more clarity around the energy funding and whether that will be any more news for charities in due course. So I thought that might be helpful just to kind of pause a little bit before we run headlong into our seminar for today and just reflect a little bit on the environment that all of our charities are working in at the moment. And I wanted to touch then on the impact I think that could have on the sector and how that can be considered by yourselves as leaders and charities, what options there are available to you at the moment. So in terms of impact on the sector then, well, I think as we've seen, there's going to be an increase in demand from beneficiaries. I think that goes without saying. More people will need more support. There are going to be more demands on charities and voluntary organisations than there has been before. Income is likely to be squeezed, whether that's from investments, or whether that's people giving less, or whether that's the impact of inflation on the value of the amounts we receive. And we'll touch on all of these in a bit more detail in the coming slides. Costs are increasing, I think that goes without saying. Inflation, energy costs, whatever it may be, costs are going up. And staff and volunteers are going to be affected as well. And nobody's operating in isolation from this. So the impacts across the sector are really quite significant and pose some real challenges, I think, in terms of managing those. Interestingly, the Pro Bono Economics, they do some really good research around the sector and the financial state of the sector. Their thoughts were that the resources charities have to manage to service this increased demand are going to be significantly and dangerously stretched. And I think that's quite true. There's more and more demands on charities and less resources with which to meet those demands. Talking of demands then, and again, I do like a graph, but this shows, this chart shows the number of referrals by the Citizens Advice Bureau to food banks and charities. And it runs from May 20 to August 22. And if you see nothing else on that graph, you can see the trend. Increasing numbers of people are asking for help. In the 3 months to September 22, it averaged 23,000 people a month being referred by the Citizens Advice Bureaus to charities and food banks for assistance. That's 32% higher than at the peak of the pandemic. It's 85% higher than the same time last year. And it's 150% higher than before the start of the pandemic. So some real challenges here, and we haven't even got into winter yet. This ran to September. So the resources, but the difficulty we've got is that everyone's already quite stretched, right? We've all just come off the back of the pandemic. People aren't operating at capacity necessary, but this is what's happening in terms of demand for the sector at the moment. And this, as I said, is just till September. And there's a really worrying quote, actually, from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which said, "We hear of people that are unable to cook the food that they have from food banks because they cannot afford to switch on their oven or their hob. Families limiting themselves to 1 shower a week, and elderly people riding buses all day to stay warm." And I think that breaks me slightly, I must admit, to hear that as a society, that's where people are. And so some real challenges ahead, I think, for the winter months. In terms of demand then, we've talked about the fact that from an economic standpoint, we're almost headed into recession. We're not formally there yet, but we will be very clearly. Living standards are going to have the biggest drop on record. And charities, we've got rising unemployment, household budgets being squeezed, and charities essentially facing and accommodating that demand for support. That's where people are going to head in the months ahead. So depending on the nature of your organisation, if this is something that you support in terms of vulnerable beneficiaries, some real challenges on the horizon. In terms of income then, so we touched on demand, and we talked about the fact that the cost of living crisis is going to result in more demand for many charities. It's also going to have an impact on income for charities, quite a significant impact. This chart just shows forecasts of the income for the sector through to 2024-25. And you can see basically the yellow was the pre-COVID projection up to 80 billion, and it's now forecast to be much lower. It's forecasted to be around 65 billion. And the reason for that, there's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, it's around people giving less, and we'll talk about that as well. It's about the decreasing value of what people are giving due to inflation, and also the impact of inflation on investments and investment returns. So the income, the amount of money that the sector is going to have to respond to some of these challenges, to respond to this demand, is also going to be squeezed during this time. And there's indications that this is starting to show already. So again, Pro Bono Economics did a survey, and they found that nearly 1 in 10 people had held back from donating in September. And of those who were already donating, 6%, and this was just back in September, had stopped or reduced their regular payments to charity. And I think there will be more of that in the months ahead. So again, if you're reliant on donations, if regular donations or fundraising, there's going to be a squeeze on your income there. The projections around that the sector will have about 2.2 billion less in terms of income in the next financial year. Looking at donations then, there was a survey done around the impact of the cost of living crisis on donations, and this was on existing donors. And interestingly, of those who surveyed, 69% thought that charities needed to respond to the cost of living crisis. That responsibility sat with charities. But actually only 28% were likely to give any more. So an interesting kind of disparity in terms of where that money is going to come from. This chart shows people who are already giving to charity. The lines in blue are those who are going to give less as a result of the cost of living crisis. So the question was, cost of living crisis, you're an existing charity donor, what impact is it going to have on your donations? And those on the left, in the blue, said we're going to give less. And those in the yellow on the right said we're going to give more. So you can see there's a quite significant trend here in terms of people cutting back I speak to people already, you know, you've got your veg box delivery or whatever it might be, or your Netflix subscription, people are cutting back. That's impacting charitable donations as well. Less people are donating to charity. There's also then the impact of inflation on those donations. So CAF have done a long-running YouGiving survey which looks at the average amount that people donate. So on average, people give £20 a month to charity. If they do the direct debits, that's the average amount that they do. But that amount's not changed since 2007. It's stayed at £20. So the value of that £20 since 2007 till today has dropped significantly. So the average monthly donation, £20, but it's just not keeping up with inflation, particularly when inflation's running at 11%, two-digit inflation. So that £20 donation in 2017 is worth £16.97 today and £14.90 in 2024. So as a charity, again, if you're reliant on those monthly direct debit, those donations, how do you deal with that? The value of those donations you're receiving has dropped off significantly in that time. There's a real challenge around, can you set a new normal? Can you expect people to give you higher donations? Well, in the context of everything else that's going on, possibly not, particularly when most people are saying they're going to actually give less. So some real challenges there. Is there scope to encourage donors to give more? This is not just donations, though. For those of you that do service contracts where you've got multi-year grants, it's going to be exactly the same. If you've got a £100,000 multi-year grant, by year 3, that's now going to be worth £88,000. And you're still going to be delivering the same service, if not probably more, given the demands. So this is relevant to so many organisations because there's going to be a real squeeze on income. Obviously, inflation's also going to eat into the value of those investments and into your reserves. So all real things to think about when looking at in the context of those demands going ahead. So a further example then of donations reducing, this is the amount raised by the On the Night fundraising for children in need. So back in 2018, it was £50 million. On the event that we've just had, it was 35 million. And so there's a real-term reduction of over 40%. And that's children in need, one of the most, kind of visible, well-known, well-advertised. You can see the trend in terms of the amount that they've raised. It's already there. And the consensus is this is going to get worse before it gets better, right? We're not going into a period where we're thinking inflation's about to go down and cost of living is about to go down. That squeeze is going to continue. This pressure is going to be there. And the public are generally quite good. If there are temporary blips or temporary concerns, they're pretty good at weathering those out and continuing with their donations. But when those are longer, when they can look ahead and say, actually, I don't see this getting better for the foreseeable future, that's when people make changes to their decisions and their donations. And I think there's increasingly more of that becoming evident in the sector. Interest rate rises also having a significant impact on individuals and households. Going to be a real challenge. This is tapered slightly in so much as a lot of obviously fixed rate mortgages, so those increases in interest rates aren't factoring straight through, and also decreasing levels of home ownership, so not having necessarily such a big impact. But this, again, excuse my chart, but this chart shows debt servicing as a proportion of household income. And the interesting thing here is it's actually a really, really low proportion. It's one of the lowest proportions of household income. This goes back 34 years. At the moment, the cost of servicing debt for a household, it's as low as it has ever been. And that is because we've had this period of really low interest rates, almost unnaturally low interest rates. And so it's not cost us very much to service our debt. And we've almost considered that to be normal. We've gone out and got more debt. Households are far more highly leveraged than they were in the past. So the impact of these interest rate rises on households and on household finances has the potential to have much more significant impact because we're all so highly leveraged, because we've operated in this environment. This chart goes back 34 years. So that ringed section is from 2008 onwards. And that's the environment that we've been operating. And you can see how different that was to the situation historically. So again, some real challenges when those interest rates actually start to kick in terms of refixing mortgages and to debt for individual households. Think about income by source then. Does anyone have a take on what proportion, if we took the charity sector as a whole, what proportion of the income comes from the public? Any thoughts? 90. Oh, that's high. That's a lot. It's a lot. Any other takers? So it's 50. It's 50% of the income from the whole sector comes from the public. We are the largest source of income for the charity sector. £30 billion a year the public gives charities. That's a huge figure. And then when you consider, again, the context of the environment which we're operating in at the moment, some real challenges there as to the sustainability of that level of income. Income from local government has steadily declined. That might not surprise many of you to hear. It fell 26% from 2008 to 2020. So a real steady decline. And actually, income from local government to the sector is at the lowest level it's been in 15 years. So again, from an organisation perspective, if you're looking forward, if you're doing your strategic planning, if you're looking into the future, having an awareness of your income sources, where they're coming from, but also the trends in those income sources, what's going to happen with them going into the future, is really quite relevant. And obviously, we've touched on it a little bit as well. Investment income at the moment is going to face some real challenges in the current environment as well. If I circle back to the source, chart that we talked about at the start in terms of organisations by size, it's also quite interesting to see where that income is going. So these small organisations, these are ones with income of less than £100,000, they've seen a fall of 26% in income since 2007. So they're also getting less as a proportion of charitable organisations as well. It's exactly the same for medium-sized charities, so those of income up to £1 million, they've seen a fall of 16%. And the larger charities that we talked about, well, they've grown in terms of income by 34%. So there's a real shift in terms of where that income is going in the sector as well. Also very relevant. There was some argument in this article which was done by the NCVO. It's really good. There's some links when I send the slides around, some good articles. But that they kind of thought this was down to the better strategy and the more forward thinking of these larger organisations. I don't know if that entirely holds true. It does suggest that there isn't strategic thinking in smaller organisations, but that was their explanation for that shift. But quite noticeable in terms of how that's shifted. So what can we do about these things from an income perspective as an organisation? What options are available to you? Well, the first thing I'd be doing, if you are reliant on fundraising, is having a look at your fundraising strategy. Is there anything that you need to do differently in light of this sector that we're operating in at the moment? Can those existing resources go further? Can you stretch them any further? Now, I think that's a bit of a challenge for most charities at the moment because we're all pretty stretched off the back of the pandemic. But it is something to consider and have a think about. How about your cash reserves? Do you need to think differently how you're holding those? I would say that as auditors to many charities, we very often come across balance sheet where funds aren't categorised correctly, where perhaps something has been categorised as an endowment fund when it's not, or it's been categorised as a restricted fund when it's not. Or there's an endowment fund which we've assisted a charity in applying to the Charity Commission to get approval to be able to spend. In the current environment, making sure you're absolutely sure what the legal restrictions are on each of your funds and what is available for you to spend or not is absolutely critical. There is an argument around focusing on your existing donors, where your charities that are reliant on donations, rather than incurring the spend to try and attract new donors in. Speak to the people that are already giving to you, speak to the people that already understand your organisation and what you're doing. And also, if you do need support, how well are you communicating that? You know, I might speak to charities, actually, yeah, we're really struggling at the moment. Okay, great. Have you shared that with your donors? Have you been open about that and transparent about that? How well have you communicated that need? Have you asked for more flexible funding from your donors. So when your donors are generally giving you money but with restrictions, have you had those discussions and said, actually, can we release some of these restrictions because we really need to do this over here? It would be really helpful if we had more flexibility about what we could do with this. Have those discussions with your donors, ask for that flexibility. And also, it might sound daft, but ensure that you're claiming gift aid. So many organisations that we deal with either miss that or aren't making that claim in full. So very worthwhile doing. There's also a really helpful resource, and I mentioned we will circulate the slides, and there's links on the slides, so you can literally go in and access these directly, so you don't need to write them down. But so the NCVO, it's a National Council for Voluntary Organisations. They've got a fantastic section on their website entirely around fundraising and income. As this is a response to the cost of living crisis, but there are some great sections on there all about grants, how to find grants, delivering public services, planning for funding and income, fundraising. So some great and really helpful links on there that I'd advise you to take a look at if you've not before. How to find grants, fundraising methods, lots of really interesting stuff, and it's designed to be relevant to a whole range of charities as well. So if you are looking at constraints on your income, it's a really useful resource to go to just to get some good ideas quite quickly. It wouldn't be setting the scene if we didn't talk briefly about energy costs as well. Obviously, rising energy costs are a major driver in inflation at the moment. Interestingly, energy only makes up about 7% of the inflation measure, but it actually feeds into everything else because we use energy for everything, right? We use it in production, we use it to make goods, we use fuel to transport goods, so it's having a much wider impact than just that 7%. The other thing to consider, though, is obviously rising fuel costs. From a charity perspective, if you're reliant on volunteers, have you thought about the impact that that rising fuel cost is having on your volunteer base? Do they travel to come into your organisation? Do they travel to volunteer? Are they bearing that cost in a household that already potentially quite cost constrained in the current environment? And again, beneficiaries. Are they able to access your services? Can they afford to access your services now if these fuel costs are increased and it's costing them more to travel? So all things just to consider a little bit more broadly in terms of the impact on volunteers and beneficiaries. And obviously we've talked about those household energy costs, the constraints on household financing, and more people seeking support and from food banks, from charities as a result. And again, some just worrying statistics around, before we had the energy price guarantee, 26% of income in low-income families was forecast to be spent on energy costs. That's a huge proportion. Quarter of disposable income going on energy costs. And in low-income households, the forecast was January to March of next year, they'll need to find another £420, just short of £418, just to pay their energy costs in that period. So a real impact on beneficiaries, on households, and also on charities themselves. Those have got premises that they're operating from, those have got energy costs. So some real significant impacts there as well. So again, what can we do about these things? Clearly we have no control over energy costs, but it's about then understanding the financial resilience of your organisation. How well can you deal with these constraints on income? How well can you deal with these increased costs, whether it's energy or staff costs or whatever it might be? And how can you make sure that you've got the systems and controls in place to manage these challenges? Well, governance is an absolutely key concept here. I can't overestimate this point enough. Having meetings that are frequent enough. Being quick with your decision making and responsive. Scenario planning, thinking about what might happen, different options, risk management. I'll share a story with you. This was back in March 2020. So I think it was the 16th of March. It was just before the first lockdown. We had a partners meeting. And I went in with a COVID agenda, I'll be entirely honest. I know my partners won't mind me sharing this story. And I just wanted to steer the conversation away from our agenda and entirely onto COVID, because I thought we've got a problem here coming on the horizon. And one of my partners sat there and went, well, I just don't see it. I think it's all just in the media. It's not going to happen. I'm not worried about it at all. And I was like, okay, well, I get that. I absolutely respect your opinion. I said, but why don't we make a plan? And I was like, I would be more happy than anyone if that plan sits on the shelf and we never have to use it. But why don't we make one just in case? And we did. And then when the lockdown was announced, whatever it was, 4 days later, We'd tested all of our home working, we'd tried all of these things out, we'd spoken to our staff, so everyone went home with the confidence that things worked and we had a plan for that scenario. It's so often that I speak to organisations and there'll be one forecast or there'll be one objective that they've set for the year, and there's no modelling, there's no plan A, there's no plan B, there's no consideration of other scenarios. And given the level of uncertainty in the environment we're operating in at the moment, that seems like almost a little bit blinkered. It's about broadening those horizons a little bit and doing some more scenario planning. It's also around your culture. You know, have you got partners when one of them sits there and goes, oh, well, I'm not sure, but let's make a plan anyway. We go, okay, yeah, why not? We'll be open, we'll be innovative, we'll embrace that feedback, we'll take it on board. We'll sit at a board level and talk about the cost of living crisis. We'll put it on our agenda. We'll talk about what it's going to mean for our organisation and what we can do about it. It's about the people that you've got in your organisation as well. Are they multi-skilled? Are they able? Do they have this flexibility? Is your workforce or your volunteer force flexible enough to adapt to some of these challenges? And have you got any capacity in your system to do that? Because so many people are literally operating above capacity off the back of the pandemic. Have you got the capacity in there to respond to some of these challenges? Information management, again, absolutely critical in terms of you've got the information around your organisation, who has access to it, and is it held securely, which we'll touch on with Durgan later. And finance, we talked about income diversification, we talked about that level of fixed costs, what level of income do you need to meet those? Obviously those fixed costs are going to be increasing. And what are your working capital requirements? How good is your reserves policy? Is it up to date? Have you looked at it in terms of the cost of living crisis? Have you updated it? Because certainly the Charity Commission would have expected you to, because there's a significant change in the environment that you're operating in. And if you haven't reflected back on your reserves policy and said, well, what does this mean? What do we need to do differently? Then there's definitely an expectation that you would do. And again, then, just some resources I wanted to direct you to. The NCVO, so they've said the cost of living crisis will affect every charity, whatever their size or their cause. And so they've set up this cost of living guidance, a whole hub on their website, which again has got some fantastic links. It's also got links to things that grants are available for organisations as well. So you might be aware, for example, Somerset Community Foundation, they've got a Warmer Spaces grant. So if you're a community group, if you're providing a warm space over the winter, you can apply to them and get a grant. Aviva are doing cost of living grants, ASDA is doing various things. So all of these are linked through their website as well. So again, if you're looking perhaps to diversify your income or sync income from different sources, then this is a really good resource to refer to. New Philanthropy Capital, again, you may not have heard of them, but the link will be on the slide that goes out. They've similarly got some great sections on their website. Things like, what is it like to face financial hardship in Britain? Who's going to be worst affected? What are some of the secondary effects of that? And how is that going to impact on your organisation? They also had a really interesting quote, I thought, in their view, was that the cost of living crisis is as big as COVID, possibly bigger. More people will need the help that charities will provide, and charities are going to find it harder to support them when they manage the impacts of inflation and the cost of living crisis on their own funding, as well as that reduction in income and donations, which we talked about. Their view was that we needed the level of kind of mobilisation that we saw at the start of the pandemic. So charities and voluntary sector are incredibly good at responding to the COVID pandemic. But the consensus is that hasn't happened quite as quickly with the cost of living crisis. But the need is going to be there just as much, if not potentially more. So again, a link to the guidance which is on their webpage, which is incredibly helpful. That's good, I'm on time, perfect. So the last little section for me was actually just around people. So we've talked about the impact of the wider economic environment on income. We've talked about the challenges there in terms of reduced income. We've talked about those increases in demand. We've talked about the impact on cost base as well. But it's going to impact your people in every shape or form, whether that's beneficiaries, but also your staff, your volunteers. People are so critical to the charity sector, and everyone is going to be impacted by the cost of living crisis, almost without exception. There are 1.1 million employees in the sector at the moment, and 40% of organisations are employers, so quite a significant employer. However, 43% of organisations are struggling to recruit new staff, struggling to attract in to the sector, and a lot of organisations also struggling to retain the staff that they already have. And so therefore we see quite a bit of reliance on volunteers as well. But the sector as a whole is a really big employer. We've got a pretty significant wage cost in there. This shows what that wage cost would need to increase to if it was going to keep up with the cost of inflation. So on average, charities who are employers spend 40p in the pound on staff costs. But if those staff costs keep up with inflation, that's an extra £3.8 billion next year needed just to keep staff costs up with inflation, and £6.1 billion in the following year. Now, I think it's pretty unlikely that the sector will keep staff costs pegged with the level of inflation, but the sector already, anecdotally or based on the surveys, pays less than the commercial sector, on average 7% less than the commercial sector. And the Bank of England looked at pay rises to May of this year. The commercial sector averaged about 5.6%, for charities it was 3.8%. So it's just thinking about the impact on staff, impact on your organisation of costs, of staff costs, and how, again, that's going to be managed in the current environment. If you're an average charity with income of £500,000, you'll need another £37,000 next year, just staff costs to keep them up with inflation. For a charity with income of £1 million, that's over £70,000. So some real challenges there from a cost perspective. In terms of people then, obviously volunteering is also critical for the organisation. It's crucial for our society, it's crucial for our economy, and it's so crucial for so many of the organisations that we deal with. And volunteering has been a huge part of responding to some of these crises that we've seen off the back of the pandemic and now with the cost of living crisis. So there are 4.3 million regular volunteers in the UK. This was a survey that the civil society did. So regular being someone who volunteers at least once a month. So 4.3 million volunteers who collectively do over 312 million hours of work every year in the sector, which if paid for would equate to £3 billion at national living wage costs, and actually closer to £6 billion if you did that at an average hourly rate. So crucial part of the charitable sector. But more than 50% of voluntary organisations they spoke to are finding it hard to hold on to those volunteers. 25% of organisations are losing those volunteers that they gained off the back of the pandemic. So is it now time, in the context of the wider cost of living crisis, to rethink how we're looking at volunteers? I think the good news is that actually roughly one third of the population over 16 volunteer what's called formally, so through a club or an organisation or for a society. When you take into account informal volunteering, that rises to over 50%. And I think that's a great measure of our society, that so many people are involved in volunteering and support. Interestingly, as you might expect, that is skewed towards, so this is a chart of volunteering by age group, but it's skewed towards those over 65. And there's also quite a lot of women involved in volunteering, more than men. So we see older people, we see women, and we see individuals from less deprived socio-economic backgrounds. So actually, the more well-off you are socially and economically, the more likely you are to volunteer. In fact, those aged over 65 are more than twice as likely to volunteer as those between 25 and 34. And one of the main reasons for that is that paid work continues to be a real barrier to volunteering. But again then, cost of living crisis, if more people are working, then is that going to have an impact on your volunteer workforce if that's something that you're very reliant on? The other thing that we see is that volunteers tend to volunteer in their local area. 81% of volunteers tend to volunteer where they live. But if we're looking at more volunteers coming from those less deprived socio-economic backgrounds and less charities in that sector, that then also raises some challenges around where that volunteer workforce is, where those charities are, and if they're in the same place. So people who are in more deprived areas are by default less likely to volunteer and less likely to have an organisation in that area to volunteer for. So some challenges there. The pandemic also had a really big impact on volunteering. Any of you or organisations who deal with volunteers will have seen that. There was quite a significant decline. So the blue chart here is formal volunteering, or sorry, the blue line on the chart is formal volunteering. And basically what the pandemic was there was a significant drop, a 20% drop year on year in formal volunteering, people actually undertaking formal, and a big increase on that informal volunteering, so helping your neighbour or dropping something around to, helping someone out, picking up someone's prescription, whatever it might be. But if your organisation is reliant on formal volunteering, we've already seen quite a drop in the level of people that are undertaking that formal volunteering. So some real challenges there as well. The levels of volunteering had been relatively stable, and as you can see, really the pandemic has had quite a significant shift already. Circling back then to that trend in household income, we know our household incomes have gone down. We know that paid work is a barrier to volunteering. So is it going to work? If you've got increased demand within your charity, is it going to work to access more volunteers? Are those volunteers going to be there? So after the 2008 financial crisis, formal volunteering dropped by 6%. So there was a social recession as well as an economic recession. People stopped volunteering. We've already seen off the back of COVID that there's already been a significant drop in formal volunteering. Is there a risk that we see that again and we have a social recession as well as an economic one, where people are cutting back on their time, either because they're undertaking more work or they've got more issues that they're managing? The civil society, again, has done a really interesting report on volunteering, and this is linked in on the slides. And this talks about actually the effect that some of these, the effect of the pandemic, the effect of the cost of living crisis has had on people's confidence, it's had on their willingness to volunteer, and it said it's actually making people less likely to give their time. They also found that mental health has a real impact on volunteering and people's willingness to volunteer. This is particularly for young people. They're finding challenges around managing work, around managing family, and finding the time to give up to then volunteer. 20% of regular volunteers have experienced burnout. Now, I stood here last year and talked about concerns around volunteers and staff off the back of the pandemic. People were burned out, people were tired. Well, we're here again and we're going into another challenge. People are worn out already. And also there's this feeling of guilt that they found as a result of the survey when people are unable to volunteer. Absolutely something I recognise. I absolutely have that sense of guilt. I think you want to do more, you want to fit it all in, but you can't. But people are struggling with that desire to do more and yet finding the strains of balancing that with everything else that they've got on. So if you do have volunteers within your organisation, do you have support structures for them? Is it something that you've considered? How are you supporting your volunteers, particularly at the moment? Do you have a mentoring system for your volunteers, or does that just extend to your staff? Have you thought about that? Do you have a volunteering policy? Do you have a code of conduct? And what's your two-way communication like with your volunteers? Are they involved? Are they engaged? Are they feeding back? Are they involved in your strategic decision-making and how the organisation is run? And it's really interesting, actually, Cancer Research made a statement recently that they said it was absolutely critical to them that not only their volunteers, but individuals with learned experience of cancer were involved in their strategic decision-making for the organisation, that was critical to them, that they had that two-way engagement and dialogue and feedback. And I can absolutely see that, because unless it's something that you've lived through, then you're going to be viewing that experience from a different perspective. So they viewed that as being absolutely critical. The other thing to consider is broadening your view of what volunteering can look like. Do you have a wide range of volunteer models? How can you volunteer for your organisations if you have volunteers involved? What options do you give to them? Charities really need to be quite flexible around this at the moment, quite creative. There's been, as we've seen, a real shift to more informal volunteering. So how are you reflecting that? Are you offering those opportunities, so short-term, long-term volunteering opportunities? There's some really interesting feedback from the British Heart Foundation, who'd looked at how people volunteer for them. And they said, we've had to totally remodel it. And we've gone away from these fixed hours that you come in and you volunteer for a couple of hours and go away to these ad hoc bits. There's an hour here and an hour there to capture these informal volunteers and capture their resource within their organisation. Hybrid working is here to stay at the end of the day. But if your model is a very traditional one that's based on your volunteers coming in for a certain period of time in a certain way, and yet they no longer have those constraints in their working environment, is it going to work for them to then suddenly work within those constraints from a volunteering perspective? Or do you need to be more flexible and creative around that? Equally, are you engaging with your volunteers digitally? Massive shift to digitisation off the back of the pandemic, but is something that you extend to your volunteers? Are they able to interact with you in that fashion? Another area which was really interesting was around volunteering and for young people. Do you encourage volunteering by young people? Are there opportunities for young people to volunteer with your organisation? Are those opportunities accessible and are they varied? There was a really good, again, the link on there I'd encourage you to take a look at if you do deal with volunteering at all. St John's Ambulance, absolutely amazing what they do with young people and volunteering opportunities. They start off with badges, basic first aid at year 5, student volunteering, first aid volunteering, such a range of volunteer opportunities for young people to get involved in their organisation. And again, if you're using volunteers, reliant on volunteers, is this something that you're thinking about as a potential resource? It works best generally if you can collaborate with local schools, local authorities, and also obviously there's a lot of considerations you need to think about. DBS, some of those things we talked about volunteering policies, mentoring support will become much more important when you're involved with young children. But there is the potential to transform lives there as well. You know, there was a part of this volunteering study which I was reading through, there were case studies about individuals that said, actually, this opportunity to volunteer has given me some skills that I could then take on and use and apply to work within a charity. So a really relevant resource and a really under-considered resource, I think, from a volunteering perspective. And again, there's a link on there which I shared, which is around ways in which to engage and support young people to volunteer within your organisations. There's also a really helpful, wider guidance section which the NCVO have done around volunteering, including some of these things we've talked about coordinating volunteers, safeguarding volunteers, volunteer policy, all of that, those sorts of things. So some really helpful links on there. And again, here's some links around recruiting volunteers, where to find them, planning for volunteers and your legal responsibilities. So again, even if it's not something you do within your organisation currently, something very much to consider as being relevant in the current environment. So I have finished exactly on time, which is almost a miracle. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah. She's going to do a little bit on ESG, and then we'll hand over to Becky before taking another break for coffee. Do you need my...
This one should work. Am I working? Perfect. Great. Thank you. Good morning. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Twist, an associate and charity specialist at AC Mull. So the first topic I'm going to talk about this morning is environmental, social and governance, or ESG. So ESG reporting has increased significantly over the past few years in the private sector, and the same expectation is now extending into the charity sector as well. So if we first look, there are 3 main pillars of ESG, and this is what, as an organisation, you should be reporting against to your stakeholders. So the first one is the environment and how your organisation interacts with its surrounding environment. And this doesn't just mean the environment as in nature, this is the whole environment you work within. The next aspect is the social aspect and how your charity interacts with the local society. And finally, the third pillar is governance and how your charity would manage that governance. So ESG reporting isn't a new thing, and there's lots of frameworks there already. So, for example, hang on, slides are different than I thought. So, for example, large corporates are already required to fulfil carbon reporting, and a lot of smaller organisations do this voluntarily. So there's frameworks in place that shows where they're reducing their carbon usage and increasing efficiencies. Under social, charities are already required to report on their public benefit and how your organisation is achieving this, with the key being doing no harm. Large companies also with over 250 employees are already required to report on the gender pay gap, and I am aware that at the moment the Women and Equalities Committee are lobbying the Parliament to widen this to report on ethnicity reporting as well. And then under governance, there's lots of frameworks that as charities you can follow. One example would be the Charity Governance Code. While this isn't a legal requirement to follow, it is endorsed by the Charity Commission, and it is considered best practice not only to keep this in mind with your organisation's activities, but also to reference to the Governance Code in your trustees' annual reports. So why is it so important for the charitable sector? So firstly, a charity is an institution for charitable purposes subject to the High Court's jurisdiction. And those charitable purposes are defined in the Charities Act as for the public benefit. So as I'm sure you're all aware, there's the two aspects to public benefit. The public aspect, which is where you need to be providing this benefit to the general public or in a wide enough proportion of that public. And then the second bit is the benefit, which not only is providing that benefit, but ensuring that any benefit you provide has no detriment or harm outweighing this benefit. So if you look at this, so while you're carrying out your charitable objectives, if you're thinking about the wider environment you're working in, you always need to keep in mind the fact that we're in a climate change emergency at the moment. So are you considering this in your objectives? If you're completely ignoring the climate change, then you could be considered to be overlooking this and that there could be some detriment or harm caused. So if we look at the charity governance codes and the charity SORP and how they relate back to ESG. So in the charity governance code, it says that the board should recognise its broader responsibilities towards communities, stakeholders, and the wider society and the environment. So while not specifically mentioning ESG, I would say that this does lead us on to thinking maybe which is something that should be considered. The Charity SORP doesn't at the moment reference ESG, but again it does talk about providing a balanced picture within your charity's report against its aims and objectives. So from the reading that I have been doing, actually I have identified that ESG, while it's not in the Charity SORP at the moment, it is on the agenda for the current SORP review that is taking place at the moment. So, where do you start with your ESG journey? So there's lots of useful metrics and tools that could be used to support you in looking at where you sit at present with ESG. So this here are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which has been produced by the United Nations. So these are the goals that they would like to see achieved worldwide by 2030. So I'm not saying as a smaller charity you should be looking to achieve all of these goals, but you can use this or other similar examples as a tool to come up with your own strategies. So so some of these may align with directly with your charitable purposes. So for example, quality education, number 4 if you're an education charity, or number 3, good health and well-being for those healthcare charities. But others are more generic. So for example, we have no poverty. So do you have policies in place for your, to make sure that you're paying a fair and living wage to all of your employees? Then we have gender equality and reduced inequalities. So again, with your recruitment strategies, do you have equality, diversity and inclusion policies for your recruitment and for your grant giving policies as well? Then with affordable and clean energy, Are you in an old building? How is it heated? Is it insulated? When you change your boiler, are you just going with the same old one, or are you considering the benefit and cost in relation to changing to a new modern technology? So, and then also in addition to this, you have where you have investments, are you ensuring that those are in ethical and sustainable funds? So how do you start your ESG journey? So ESG is really, it's a call for action. It's thinking about where you want to be as an organisation and where you want to sit in the world. So if you consider at what stage you're currently at, this is thinking about the sustainability of your organisation, not just the environmental perspective. It's from being sustainable to say that you still want to be there in the future. So once you sit and look at this, you're probably a lot further ahead than you think. You can look at your existing activities and how do they fit in with the 3 pillars of ESG. Do you have any of your employees or staff interested in sustainability? They can be a great resource and will probably already have ideas about what you could be doing more. And then you could establish a working group using those resources you already have to do so. This is something that we've done at AC Mall. We have our green team, where there's dedicated staff who look at the things that we can do, but it's also open that any other staff can share ideas of things that we should be doing, and they do get considered. So overall, you need to be looking at your long-term aspirations of where you want to be for the future. And this doesn't need to be something that is achievable in the short term. This is way in the future to make sure that you are always still in existence. And then from that, you can come up with some meaningful actions which you can achieve, which are more achievable to set you on that path. So it's just remembering that this is a journey and no one's expecting you to get there overnight. But it's good to have this clear goal in addition to your charitable objectives. So behind this, if you are going to look at an ESG strategy, it's really important that you gain your trustee support and endorsement to make sure that everyone is on board and agrees with the direction you're heading. So as a charity, what are the benefits of engaging with ESG? So firstly, by engaging, it shows that it demonstrates your value as a charity and your responsibility that you're taking as to funders. Some bid proposals now may have elements of this in there wanting you to explain what you're doing. So if you already have these strategies in place, you've already got this information ready to share. So when you're looking to recruit staff and volunteers, more and more people, and especially the younger generations, are looking to engage with and work with organisations who actually have an interest in the world and the wider community. So potentially it can help attract better talent and to retain those staff. If your objectives align with other organisations, it might encourage corporates to want to work with you as a sustainable charity. And then you have, where you have driven improvements and efficiencies, that some of these could potentially be cost savings when you're looking at the energy side of things. So behind this, the key is to understand your stakeholders' needs so you can align any strategy that you have to the expectations that your stakeholders may have of you. So if you have a strategy and you're working towards it, then you want to be reporting on it. And so where do you want to do that? So ideal place to be doing that would be within your trustees' annual report. Some organisations might choose to have a separate report to report on how they're doing these things, but the annual report is a perfect place. So you can share your progress and your plans. So even if you're at a very early stage of your journey and you just have plans of this is what we want to achieve, it's also very good to share that information with your stakeholders. Where you are reporting any information, you need to make sure that you hold that data to the same standard as any other financial data you report. So if you're reporting on reduced carbon emissions or reduced paper uses, you need to make sure that it is comparable year on year, and that you're clear on those data sources and the assumptions so that that data does have some credibility. So there are some good examples I've seen from some large organisations where they either have a separate ESG report or they have an element of this within their trustees' annual report. So I have just linked in a couple of those if anyone was interested in taking a look at those. Okay. So just the whole overarching part of ESG is about the long-term sustainability, because I know that everyone in this room wants their charity to still be there in the future. And that there is still, and the environment for us is all still here as well. So now I will pass you over to Becky Aldridge.
Stick it in a clip it somewhere. Oh, everyone can hear me.
Okay, you're on.
I'm going to go with that mic. So thank you very much, Sarah. And yeah, just to introduce, just delighted to introduce actually Becky Aldridge, Chief Executive of Dorset Mental Health Forum. Becky's going to tell us a little bit about the charity and the great work that they do and all of her experience as a Chief Exec. So I'll leave you with Becky's capable
give me the clipper. Clicker. Fantastic. Right. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's obviously a real pleasure to get a heads up of what Sarah's going to be talking to me about when I come to do the TAR in Q4. Always a pleasure. And who in this room is feeling a little bit kind of, oh my God, it's all a bit depressing, isn't it? Cost of living, so much to think about, oh dear. And, you know, this is very, very real stuff for all of us. And my presentation is going to be a little bit kind of left field in a way. And I'm going to make an apology now for maybe being a little bit too positive in the face of such negativity. But hopefully it'll be helpful. So I'm Becky Aldridge. I'm the Chief Exec of the Dorset Mental Health Forum. It's a real pleasure for us to work with ACMOL, and we worked with ACMOL for a few years, and we're very conscious that we're over the boundary in terms of working with a Somerset organisation, but actually it really works for us, and that kind of transference of different perspectives is really helpful too. But I don't think the issues that we face in Dorset are any different to the issues that you guys face in Somerset. And I'm going to say a little bit about the forum, simply because I want to kind of create some context and set some scenes. So we're an independent charity. We started in 1992, and we started at a point when the asylums in Dorset and across the country were finally closing. Now, in mental health history, that's actually and in social history, that's a very short period of time for a significant change. And I mention that because actually when we started 30 years ago, we started as a very small group of people having a voice about having an experience of living with a mental health condition at a time when you didn't talk about that stuff. If you had a mental health condition, which I do, and my whole workforce do, and I manage it on a day-to-day basis, and I'm proud of that, and actually it's expertise that I bring into my work, and so do my workforce. 30 years ago, you kept quiet about that, and people didn't want to know about that, and frankly, they had all sorts of views and perceptions of their own. But what we've done over the last 30 years is build an infrastructure of that voice, of that lived experience, to bring about social change, to influence, we work very closely with the NHS, we work inside the NHS to transform, to utilise our experience and expertise, and I've got a workforce of around 80 people and growing, and we utilise our workforce and our expertise as a collective voice and to bring about change. Now, a lot of the issues that have been outlined this morning, you know, these are real, a lot of our beneficiaries are people who are in that lowest bracket. So for us, that kind of rise in demand that Lexi was speaking about this morning, it's very pertinent, really pertinent. And actually the kind of the layering on of the social determinants for people in terms of their housing, the experiences they have, the challenges they may have if they've got a mental health condition or they've got a range of different things going on for them. They may or may not have employment. But from our point of view, positivity, number one, what an opportunity. You know, we're an organisation that exists to raise awareness and challenge people's thinking and actually increase in demand and actually highlighting and a spotlight on the issues that are really significant for people, I think is quite an opportunity. So that's a little bit about us and kind of our story. And this slide we use a lot, and we've used it a lot. I've been in the charity for 22 years. So I've been around a long time, and a kind of almost founder, but not quite founder. And when I started, I was one of the first employees as well. So we've kind of grown this together. But this quote is something that's really important to us because, and it was more relevant then, although it's still relevant today, it is about that the biggest crime is actually in not setting the bar high enough. So if we say, cost of living, experiences of mental health conditions, poor this, unattractive that, it's all doom and gloom, and we keep the bar low, and we say, well, there's no point. Let's give up, because actually it's all too much, and people's experiences are too difficult and too traumatic. How are they ever going to get past that? That, in my view, that's not the right attitude in this day and age. In my view is we keep that bar high. We keep it as high as possible. We expect the most. We go out to work every day to achieve the best that we can in spite of growing adversity and difficulty. So this is a quote we've used for years, but it still applies in my mind. So as a charity, what do we do? Well, our vision is a world that this lofty vision, a world that understands mental health and where people and communities can enjoy good mental health, where there's shared humanity and appropriate support when people experience emotional distress and trauma. Because actually, 30 years ago, very different view around mental health, but I would wager there isn't one person in this room who doesn't think about their mental health and well-being in the same way as isn't aware that they need to think about their mental health and well-being in the same way as they have to think about their physical health. We have a very different understanding today around mental health and around how it becomes compromised, how we need to look after it, what severe and enduring looks like, and some understanding of how severe and enduring mental illness develops and the relationship between the need to understand what's going on for us and to get support early so that actually we don't become increasingly unwell. So for us, that building understanding of how you get from here to here, how you look after yourself in that day-to-day, how you build capacity in local communities, especially at a time when there is a lot that's bringing people down in real, legitimate ways. So that shared humanity is really, really important. We all understand what it's like to struggle one way or another. Now's the time for us to really share that understanding together. So our mission is around increasing that understanding. And we have a concept called recovery, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about. And building capacity within communities around this stuff, because that's important. But also, and you will be getting a feel of this from the way that I'm speaking, our values are very important to us, and they underpin everything that we do. And we try to be an organisation that doesn't just have the words popped on the bottom of an email footer or publications. The honesty that people have to have in their day-to-day lives in order to get through their adversity, to have the courage to speak up and do the things that they need to do to move forward in their recovery journeys. The importance of compassion with ourselves, with each other, with everyone around us are so important, so on and so forth. And the integrity, actually, when we're doing business is really important for us as well. So we use our values as a touchstone and a part of our day-to-day literacy, and that guides us well as an organisation. They're our compass in lots of ways. So this word recovery, what do I mean by that? So in the mental health field, broadly, the concept of recovery is something that's been around for a while, and we have our own kind of take on it, and again, it underpins our business and has done for many years. And we have a formal partnership with the NHS in Dorset called the Dorset Wellbeing and Recovery Partnership, which was formed in 2009. And Lexi, when you were talking, and we were, your lovely graphs, which I love actually, the kind of thinking about mapping our journey with the different interest rates and the different economic environment, it feels like something that would be positive to do. But this word recovery, when the partnership started in 2009, was really important because it's not about clinical recovery, I'm going to get better, it's about personal recovery. And we use this quote, there's a second part to it in a minute as well, but what it basically says is, when there's a crisis in your life, when something happens, when you get a diagnosis of a mental illness, when something traumatic and difficult happens in your life's going to change. You're not going to go back to where you were before. When you go through a difficulty, a trauma, you don't go back to where you were before. And also you kind of have to, you incorporate the learning that you have from the thing that you're dealing with into a new way of living and a new way of thinking. And it's the same with mental health, but it's the same with a load of other things as well. And you begin to see, actually, through recovery as a philosophy, you discover things about yourself through that learning and through that journey, and you begin to see what you've got control and agency of yourself. So a lot of the work that we do with services and with people is about, well, let's not think about, let's not bang on about all the things that other people need to fix for you. What can you do for yourself? What do you have control and agency over? And that's a really, really big part of recovery and why we use this as a philosophy. And the reason I talk about recovery is because actually we think that concept of something happens, taking the learning, integrating the learning, discovering parts of yourself and shaping a new way of being and realizing what you have control and agency of yourself is a really important part of what we all face, and that those principles are transferable whether you're talking one-to-one with a beneficiary, whether you're talking about teams, whether you're talking about organisations. And I think it's important and relevant in the context of the environment that we're currently in. So what have we got control of? What can we do for ourselves? And, again, literacy around change. Isn't that so important? This is such a period of difficulty, such a period of volatility and uncertainty, such an ambiguous period. And actually, it doesn't matter really whether you're a beneficiary, whether you're a chief exec, whether you're a trustee, whether you're an accountant, whether, not that you guys are a separate breed, obviously, but, whatever your role or your function or you kind of whatever you do, you're going to be, as Lexi was saying this morning, everyone is going to be impacted and is impacted by the pandemic, now the cost of living, there'll be something else in a minute. So we all have to change, and we all are impacted and swept away by these huge tsunamis of things that are happening to us. So understanding and kind of developing literacy around change and supporting each other and that shared humanity is so important, and because it's not going to change. There isn't round the corner this nice, soft, fluffy world where actually everything's going to be easy. And one of the things that I really liked about the pandemic was this thinking about, and actually, ladies, I'm hopeless with time, so I think, somebody might need to tell me when I've got 10 minutes left or something. One of the things that I liked about the pandemic, actually, was, and discovered by accident, was this concept of the word crisis in the Chinese language, the word crisis, the two symbols are danger and opportunity. And for me, that's really exciting, actually, because that's through adversity, through difficulty, there is, in fact, opportunity. And if I'd done my research and preparation in the way these ladies obviously did this in preparation for today, I'd have something up here about some of the inspirational people that have formed amazing organisations at the most crucial times. So there's a lovely story, which somebody in the room might know, about the guy who's responsible for the big issue and a whole kind of range of work and benefit that guy was able to surface and create at a time of real adversity and difficulty. And I think that's the opportunity for us, and the thing that perversely gets me quite excited. There is so much difficulty, but there's so much opportunity. And, we all, again, we will have all heard this, that says we're all in the same storm, but actually it's that we're all in the same sea, and the what's your boat like, and who's in what boat, and with the context of, oh, well, you've got a better boat than I have for this environment or whatever, but actually we have control over what sort of boat we've got and what modifications we need to do and what we need, because actually this choppy sea is not going to change. And also, some of these vessels can get a bit mardy, can't they? It actually is a very, in the voluntary sector at the moment, I don't know what it's like in Somerset, but in Dorset, oh my God, with integrated care systems, opening up to the VCSE as part of the long-term plan, the voluntary sector is suddenly a really cutthroat place to be, and that's quite tricky as well. So, interesting environment in lots of ways. So from our point of view, the pandemic and now the cost of living, we kind of, a bit like Lexi was talking about with the digital transformation stuff, we hadn't done a plan, but we were doing quite a lot of digital work before that. We'd got a plan around digital transformation. Along came the pandemic, and it was, better get on with that pretty quick. And fortunately, again, a bit like Lexi was describing, we were able within a week to shift everything to home working and digital working because we were at that point. So for us, the pandemic was a real opportunity because actually it accelerated our digital transformation work. It meant that people were at home, working from home. They didn't, we had to roll out a load of equipment, which we did, that was fine. But also, we had a captive audience with our workforce to be able to get on and do some of the training and development that they needed to do around digital. We created a whole new way of working around a whole range of stuff. A big part of the work that we do is around recovery education, which had always been face-to-face. We now have a really well-developed digital offer. We've been able to increase our reach with people because we've been working digitally. We carried on doing face-to-face stuff as well, but we were able to get a different perspective on interesting things happened around mental health services in terms of some people were very pleased that they didn't have to keep going along to their CMHT and showing up, and actually being able to have a bit more autonomy and freedom around their day-to-day worked well for them. Other people really struggled, and we were able, because we had the autonomy and control, we were able also to be flexible about how we help people in local communities. So, developing our workforce and having some time and space to do some of that development work ourselves was really, really helpful. Now, we were in a fortunate position because a big chunk of our funds at the moment comes from the statutory sector, it comes from health, and it comes from health because we kind of operate as a social enterprise and came up with a kind of trading methodology in lots of ways, which Sarah and I have argued about for years, in terms of how that works and everything else. But it's served us well. It's served us very well. And I'll come back to that in a minute as well, because a big part of the work that we've been able to do over the last couple of years, and actually we were doing it before the pandemic, is really getting underneath our cost base, and we are rigorous with our full cost recovery. We are so rigorous with our full cost recovery that actually we managed to lay down some stores, quite a few stores, over the last couple of years, which will serve us well. And the other couple of things that we've been able to do in the last couple of years as well is refresh our board, refresh our strategy. Now, it would be fair to say that we haven't struggled too much in the last couple of years, but we will struggle in a minute, and we know we're going to struggle in a minute. And when we refreshed our strategy, we refreshed it with an intentional focus on communities, on health inequalities, on the difficulties that we knew were coming out of the pandemic for people anyway. Oh, and then there's a cost of living. So because we took some time when the world all went to digital, and we used that time productively, I guess we've made a bit of a plan for the next couple of years, or the next few years, and kind of longer term, that will fit with that increased demand that I was talking about just now. I am a strong believer in necessity being the mother of invention. You know, I think we need a burning platform. Like I say, I've been around for a long time, and I remember when things were tricky, when I used to lay awake at night thinking, where the hell are we going to get the next grant from? How are we going to make ends meet? How are we going to do this and do that? It's been okay for the last few years, but that time is coming again. The NHS is getting pinched on money. That competition that we're experiencing in the voluntary sector, we've worked hard to have a privileged place for a long period of time, but it's going to come to an end. There's going to be more people. We're going to have more competition. We already do have more competition. And our product, what we do with our lived experience expertise, has been very innovative and everything else for a long period of time, but actually other people are now catching up with us. So, you know, our conditions are starting to change. It's been in the backdrop of the cost of living. And I really like this. I really like these metaphors around the ice melting, because actually, you know, that it's pretty fundamental, isn't it, in terms of, ooh, it all feels a bit tricky, and I'm going to have to get a new life raft if I'm going to cope with this. And also, going back to the change literacy and thinking about, I really like the work of John Cotter, Our Iceberg is Melting is actually the title of this John Cotter book. And you won't be able to see this from here, but there's a foreword by a chap called Spencer Johnson, who was responsible. Who remembers that really old book, Who Moved My Cheese? Oh, yes. Yeah? So the concept of, well, we've always got money from the same place and it's all going to be fine. Oh, hang on a minute, it's not all fine. And I think it's human nature to kind of, but what do you mean you can't give me money anymore and it's not coming from the same place? That concept of, oh, hang on a minute, I've got to rethink what I do and be agile and think about what is required. And I've got to find a new source of cheese and a new source of money, and I've got to be curious and inventive and creative. That's hard. From my point of view, it's quite hard because I've been quite comfortable for a while. So I probably need to feel a little bit of the cold in order to get sufficiently motivated to get out there and find some new cheese. But there's another issue for us as well. So at the beginning, I talked about the mental health journey, and you know, things have changed a lot over the last 30 years. We were set up to influence change. We were set up to get the NHS to think, and statutory organisations to think differently around mental health. We were set up to encourage the general public to think differently around mental health. But the conversations that, when I say the conversations we're having, the conversation I'm having with one or two people who are ready to have it within our organisation, with our board, is, but what's our end game? When do we actually wake up one morning and think, our work here is done? Everyone understands mental health. We don't, you know, what is the long-term future of our organisation? Because we're not automatically thinking, we're going to be here forever, and survival forever is the end game, because I don't actually believe that it is, and it may not be the right thing for that to be the case either. So we're thinking about, well, what is our model now? What is our model for the next 5 to 10 years? You know, a lot of what we do is what we call open source, which is it's available to everybody. The whole point of what we're about is to get people to think differently. We're not trying to make money by that. We're trying to influence change. So it kind of goes without saying there will be a point, hopefully, if we've been successful with our strategy, where our work here is done. So what does that look like? And what's our income going to do? What's the income line? Because actually you could argue that there will be less need for our activity, and therefore our income will go down. Our income at the moment, which I can't quite get my head around, our income at the moment is about 1.5 mil, which is like, and how did that happen? And it's happened over a period of time, but I think our income will start to drop, and I don't have a problem with that. What's really important is that we are fulfilling our purpose and that we're meeting beneficiary need. But the other part of that is, okay, we've been ploughing a furrow, an important furrow for the last 30 years, and different furrows during that 30 years, actually. But what's the next furrow for us? Where do we go from here? So we do have clarity of purpose, and we've spent a lot of time doing that in times when we've been better off and things were, we've done a lot of work in the last 5-6 years probably around our clarity and purpose. We know what our product is. Our product is our lived experience expertise. We trade on that. That's pretty standard. We might broaden that a little bit, but we will watch out for mission creep, because actually we're here for a specific purpose, for a specific public benefit. Our objects in our constitution are very clear around that. Full cost recovery, I mentioned it just now, really important, and consolidating on that, particularly in the cost of living situation. Our unit cost, because we take everything down to an hourly rate, our unit cost has stayed the same for the last 3 or 4 years. This year, we've had to up our unit cost in order to get to where we need to be in terms of being able to, we've just given staff a cost of living pay rise, actually. The board, rightly so, well, how are you going to pay for that? Well, because actually our unit cost has to go up a bit. And that's okay, because we're all in the same sea. We're all in the same storm, and we will hold the line on that because we're doing the right thing for our workforce. And that's the most important, because the forum is nothing without our workforce. But thinking about capacity and capability moving forward, I'm glad you guys were talking about people this morning, because our wage bill is huge. We have a very high head count for a not in the context of what you said this morning, not a relatively small organisation, but because I suppose we work with big organisations, we think of ourselves as relatively small, but we do have a high head count. So, but that constant discussion around transferable skills, building agility, and thinking about progression for people. We've deliberately encouraged, all of our workforce have innately set the bar too low for themselves. So we work with our workforce and our beneficiaries to raise the bar, which means that we have to create opportunity for progression for our workforce. We can't ask people to bring their whole selves to work, utilising their lived experience, and then pay them peanuts. That's the antithesis of what we're about. So, but building that capacity and capability across the organisation and making sure that we are seaworthy as a vessel for the future and where we are today and the next crisis that's going to come around the corner is really, really important. And also, I think being asset focused is really important to us, and it's a really important part of that recovery concept and those principles. So, it's holding on to what's strong and building on what's strong, and kind of recognizing that we have worked hard to have a position of influence and integrity, and thinking about, if we keep that at the core, then where do we go with that? How do we use that position of integrity and influence? Thank you. Oh, I'm quite close to the end, so that should be all right. And also for us with the next furrow is, what is the change that we need to drive now? So I guess part of what I'm saying is we can get very distracted by the environment that we're in. Of course, the environment is really important. We've got to respond to it. But actually, our point and purpose as an organisation is still key. So what is the change around mental health, particularly in this environment, that we now need to make? So really galvanising ourselves around that and not being distracted by what other organisations are doing over here, because there's a lot of copying going on at the moment, which I find very discombobulating, and taking our lead from beneficiaries and stakeholders. We've worked hard, but what do people need us to do now in the current climate? And I really believe that the money then follows. That actually, if you are really clear on what your role and your purpose and your function is, and you get creative around that, then the money follows. And an important part of that as well in today's society, and again, you talked about it this morning, Lexi, is there's lots of boats in that sea, and there's been a lot, through the pandemic, there's been a lot of organisations and communities, informal volunteering, but communities as well, gathering together and doing some amazing stuff. And I think now is a really important time to build on that, working with people that you've never worked with before, pooling resources, getting creative together, getting energetic together around the change that you want to see and that needs to happen, and to galvanise for those beneficiaries and all those folks out there who really, really need our support. and taking the opportunity as well to kind of, where's the impact? You know, how can we be clear about the most impact that we can collectively, that we can have, and how we do that? And being creative and curious around using design thinking techniques for that too. So I guess what I'm saying is, let's try not to be all negative. Let's try and think about opportunity. Let's think about what we can do. Let's be strengths focused. Let's be curious. Let's think about the recovery principles and stay hopeful. Think about opportunity. Think about control. What can we control? What can we get alongside our beneficiaries to help them to control? How can we collaborate together to do that? What are the values that are guiding us? Staying true to our values and staying true to the principles of what our organisations are innately about, I think is the challenge and the opportunity, and actually the seaworthiness of this current storm that we're in the middle of. I'm done.
Amazing. Oh, I switched you on. I better switch you on.
Switch me off.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Becky. That was absolutely fantastic. And actually, I feel much needed actually to kind of lift the room a little after the depressing news around the cost of living crisis and everything that we started off. And some really valid points actually about just twisting some of those challenges and turning them on their head a little bit and looking at them as opportunities from an organisational perspective, from a personal perspective, rather than just being negative and saying, oh gosh, you know, woe is me. Very much going, okay, well, this is happening. What can we do about it? What's within our control? And I think that's the point from the cost of living crisis piece. There's nothing that we can do about that wider environment, but what is it that's within our control? What can we adapt? How can we adapt and make ourselves more seaworthy so that we can weather that sea or that storm that's on the horizon? So thank you. That was fantastic. We now have a break for 20 minutes. For those of you joining us from home, there will be a timer up on your screen, so you'll be able to go and get a coffee yourself as well. And then Durgan will be doing the session after the break around cybersecurity, followed by a technical update from Sarah. So do take the opportunity. Coffee and pastries at the back. Yeah, make yourself at home and we'll start again in 20 minutes or so. Thanks, everyone.
Again, and you are now.
Folks, if I can ask you all to return to your seats, please, that would be lovely. Folks, if I could ask you to return to your seats, please, thank you. Very well. Could you get Adam? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could all ask you to return to your seats, please. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. No rush, don't run, it's fine. I always feel bad to interrupt all the conversations and networking going on, but we will have opportunity again for lunch shortly. Delighted then to be joined by Durgan Cooper. Durgan is Managing Director at, I'm going to pronounce this wrong now, go on, pronounce. SETSAT, there we go, thank you. He's going to talk to us about cybersecurity. Exactly. Durgan can introduce himself essentially, but I'm delighted to be joined by Durgan this morning, and I'll hand you over with no further ado.
Thank you.
Am I live? I'm a bit live. Well, thank you, Lexi, for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me this. Certainly, I share your pain. I am the chair. I'm gone. Like that. I'm the chair of Charity here in Somerset, which by the medium-sized charity. I've learned a lot myself this morning, and I've come to talk to you about cybersecurity. So why is that relevant? Well, as we've heard this morning, we've got a decline in potential income, and sadly, at the same time, we've got cyber criminals globally trying to take more money from everybody indiscriminately, and dare I say it, charities will very much fall into that. A bit of background about myself. I work across a number of different organisations, not all represented here, but around tech, cyber, artificial intelligence, smart buildings, and at the bottom there, you'll see there's Army. So I am a reserve officer I'm a special officer in a cyber defence regiment. I've got about 100 soldiers and officers that work with me or for me, essentially across defence, government, special forces, so the complete plethora of defence assets, essentially. And my intent this morning is to give you a reverse ladder, essentially, to give you a bit of a perspective around nation-state warfare, then down into the charitable sector, and then hopefully bringing it down to a bit more relevance to you as individuals and the risks that face us all. So, to start off with, it's a little bit dark on here, but I always like to get a good old Tom Clancy book title, and this one is quite relevant for the moment with Red Storm Rising. Now, certainly that could be a perspective on the war in Ukraine, but also the Far East is certainly a big topic for us at the moment. Now, certainly in Ukraine, you'll remember the annexation of Crimea back in 2014, and prior to that, the first real global, or the first real globally recognized cyber warfare was conducted against Iran in the Stuxnet incident against the nuclear program that they were running. But certainly cyber warfare against Ukraine started before the actual physical assault back in 2014. And that sort of cyber effect has continued for almost a decade now. And ultimately, what we have seen over the last several years is a combination of both physical and cyber effect. Now, this chap is Valery Gerasimov. He leads the Russian army, and he came up with the concept of a hybrid warfare where essentially kinetic effect is delivered alongside cyber to create mass disruption and so on. Now, certainly the downside of that is that with cyber weapons, often when they're let loose into the wild on the internet, they can often score an own goal. They are loose in the wild and obviously targeting systems and so on. And certainly with what we've seen this year, since the attack this year on the 24th of February, the cyber attacks essentially rose significantly the week before the physical attack into Ukraine. But what we've seen this year is essentially crowdsourced hacking, sort of led by Anonymous, where essentially we've seen a decline in the Russian effectiveness because of a globally non-military, non-nation state attack against Russia. However, what we've also seen is out in China and Iran, one might suggest North Korea as well, essentially also creating their own cyber weapons and also coming into the fray. So whilst physically and kinetically they're not involved, albeit obviously by proxy they may well have been, what we are seeing is that the Chinese and the Iranians are also increasing their attacks and their presence online. So why is that important to us as charities and businesses and organisations? Is that, as I've suggested, sadly, we often get caught up as innocent bystanders to this. And where these weapons essentially are being commoditised into almost commercial criminal gangs. So essentially, the cyber weapon is created by nation states, or the big vulnerabilities, which take huge investment, essentially come down on the ladder into criminal organisations who can exploit it to the point that you can actually buy, for example, hacking as a service, where, and beyond that, our children, young adults predominantly, but not limited to, I hasten to add, are also getting into cyber criminality because it's such an easy way of making money. Lo and behold, we don't see many hold-ups these days. Most criminal activity now is conducted online and is certainly to the UK one of the biggest risks to UK commerce. So, are charities secure? Charities rely on their technology just as much as business, as the government, as the military. And sadly, as we've had demonstrated amply this morning, we often have as charities more constraints placed upon us for that investment. Certainly, it's reported that obviously larger charities invest more in their technology and their cybersecurity, and that's just because of the volume of monies that they've got. But most importantly, in 2022, over half of UK charities hold electronic records of their customers, and 37% enable people to donate online. So big areas of surface there to be attacked. And obviously that brings with it greater responsibility to keep that data safe. Certainly with GDPR, which you'll probably remember came into effect as the latest Data Protection Act in 2018, charities and voluntary organisations are not exempt to that. So as trustees and as directors of charities, we are all responsible for protecting that data, protecting our donors' information and those of our beneficiaries. So some trends and stats in the charity sector. Charities experienced increased digitisation through the last few years through the pandemic. We've seen that, we've heard that this morning. And 67% continue to deliver their effect remotely, working from home and so on. So the come back to the office is slow. Depending on who you talk to, I think it's going to continue, albeit I'm seeing certainly in large enterprise the drive very much towards getting people back into their offices because, dare I say it, their perspective is that productivity is not as great. 1 in 8 charities experienced cybercrime in the last 12 months, but I would hasten to add that it is expected that less than 50% of electronic crime is actually reported. Sadly, due to this, the police are not well equipped, they're not staffed because of the nature and the knock-on effect of or under-reporting of the crime. So it's a vicious cycle. And yet, coming back to Becky's point, sadly, is my work done? It's never going to be done. Cybercrime, cyber warfare is only but going to increase. 24% of charities, only 24% of charities actually have a formal policy in place to manage their cyber risk. And obviously the cost of living exploits not only target yourselves, but also those of your customers. So with a compromised website, for example, and a phishing campaign, your monies, the monies that could be due to come into your organisations could be diverted to those charities. So obviously looking not just at your anti-malware and the sort of standard tools that we use to protect ourselves, it's also the websites and those others that we employ. So how can we protect ourselves? I'm not going to go into chapter and verse, sadly, it's such a huge subject, but some headlines essentially. My first and foremost is user education. 92% statistically of compromise through cyber effect has some form of human interaction. Now, certainly whether or not that training takes place in a classroom or online, which is slightly more dynamic and regular, some form of education is absolutely necessary. The majority is now ransomware and phishing attacks, so just being able to identify if emails are legitimate, URLs are legitimate is absolutely key. Policies, I spoke about a short while ago, so having password policies, what we call least privilege, so giving people only the access to information that they require rather than unfettered access to entire organisation. I've been into organisations where every staff member has access to, for example, to things like payroll information, HR information and so on. Lock it down to those key individuals that are required. Backups, trying to promote backups 20 years ago was really difficult because no one had lost data. I find that is very similar in cyber currently. People haven't necessarily been affected themselves, and therefore cyber or investment in both time and financially into cyber security is often after the event. So having a plan, as was discussed earlier, is absolutely key. What if situations, what would your organisation do if you couldn't access your systems, your finance systems, any system? And obviously having backups of that data is absolutely key. And then you've got your general IT security products, your antivirus and firewalls protecting maybe just your office, but because of the remote working situation, you may actually go as far as to protect increasingly those individuals working from home. Multi-factor authentication, absolutely key as well, certainly around those accounts that can be. At an organisational level, however, I would suggest that you look at something called Cyber Essentials. This was created back in 2014 by the government as the baseline for cybersecurity. In the UK, there are 27 recognised cybersecurity standards or frameworks. Cyber Essentials is the bottom rung on the ladder. If you don't need or wish to have the badge, which costs a few £100s, I would suggest that you just go through the process of implementing the 5 controls that Cyber Essentials promotes, which will reduce the threat of cyber attack or cyber compromise by up to 80%. So absolutely critical, in my mind, that all businesses look at this as a starting point on their journey for cybersecurity. As I suggested back at the start, I was just going to try and bring this down to more of a human level. So a bit of a story for you. This is real. This happened within the last month. A good friend of mine, I was working in Barcelona with in October. He returned back to the UK. He was online on a Zoom call. And during that Zoom call, he was slightly distracted, as we all can be, received an email on another screen from Apple, informing him that he needed to update his details for his Coinbase Pro account, cryptocurrency account. And distracted from the Zoom call, he quickly logged into his Apple account on his other screen, said yes, and duly turned his attention back to the Zoom call. Within 2 minutes, the criminals had mocked up a fake Apple website. He did not realize that he was putting his credential, he'd been phished essentially. He'd received an email taking him off to a lookalike Apple website. He was putting in his real credentials. The criminals simultaneously were typing his credentials into the real Apple website. He had his multi-factor authentication, typed in the code from his phone. They were typing in the code into the real legitimate Apple website. And within 2 minutes, he was receiving a stream of emails informing him that his backup password had been changed, his telephone number had been changed, and so on. And within 5 minutes, his Apple phone and his Apple laptop that he was actually conducting the online Zoom call on, all were remotely wiped, and he lost his digital life. It took him 2 weeks to gain some form of resemblance to his digital life. Today, almost a month after the event, he still does not have his Apple account back. He will never get that back, despite having been into the Apple store and prove his identity through his passport, his telephone number, and so on. So it can happen to anyone. The Deputy Director of the NCSC himself, National Cybersecurity Centre, was compromised only but a few years ago. It can happen to any of us, and certainly those of us in the room, or the majority of us in the room, are senior leaders within organisations who are going to be the targets. Now, this specifically was a random one. It just so happened that he had an Apple account and he had a Coinbase Pro account. The criminals will be sending out thousands of these emails, hoping to get 1 or 2 of us compromised. It's indiscriminate. So therefore, my advice is to concentrate on your actions individually. Review the URLs, the web addresses in the browser bar of where you're actually being redirected. Use unique passwords and a password manager. There is a form of hacking which is called credential stuffing, which is where if you were to use the same username and password, your username is often your email address. If you were to use the same credentials, your username and a password, if that website were compromised, inevitably your details or those credentials would be sold on the deep web, and essentially criminals will buy those credentials and try and just log into any number of websites with the hope of getting through and being able to exploit your good nature, your money, or something from that compromise. Interestingly, what this chap didn't do was he didn't have his passwords backed up. So as much as he was using a password manager, he didn't actually have the access and the passwords backed up. So you can, using these technologies, have the ability to download it into an encrypted password-protected file, which then you can upload if you move computer and so on. So make sure you back that up. And also the MFA accounts. Now, certainly there is a bit of difference of opinion about the best way to run multi-factor authentication, if it's through an app or through a text message. If it's through a text message, which arguably may be slightly easier to spoof a telephone number, but as long as you have that phone and your number still, you will still receive the text. Whereas if you've got a small multi-factor authentication app, if you lose access to the app, funnily enough, you lose access to all of your accounts which have multi-factor authentication. So make sure you back that up so that when you recover a device, you can then recover all your passwords into it. Absolutely key. And coming back to that whole planning, what would you do personally in a cyber incident if it affected just you and not your organization? Use email security. Often, certainly Microsoft and Google, to name but 2, have an additional premium each month if you're using their services for your email to essentially provide some form of email security, some stripping out of malicious spam or indeed phishing websites and so on. Not completely infallible, but certainly will reduce the risk of it occurring. And then finally, using browser security. So if you have anti-malware, antivirus software, a lot of them, you get what you pay for, and certainly a lot of them will have a browser extension which will check the website that you're going to prior to letting you go there to enter credentials, or it will provide you with a warning at least to suggest, are you sure you wish to go here? So I hope just a few tips there about your personal security, and as I say, I hope that the relevance of nation-state warfare coming down to the charity sector and something a bit more personable is relevant to you, because it is difficult being in this industry of cybersecurity. I've had so many chief execs and MDs of companies literally crying on my shoulder, suggesting, I don't care what it costs. And as always, I would rather see prevention being easier than the cure. So I hope that's useful, and I welcome any questions if you have any, if I have time. Wonderful. I hope that was useful. Oh, please.
Sorry, I think one of the things, we have a lot of volunteers, and our cyber security can be quite good, but we're interacting with a lot of people who've got very basic knowledge.
Yes.
And that's the weak point.
No, but it's about having policies and ensuring that if people are using their own equipment, that they are maintaining them to at least a standard. So running updates, running antivirus. It may be that you as an organisation supply your volunteers with a managed antivirus, for example. So at least you have some form of control. But are people able to use their own devices? Is there donor or beneficiary information which may be stored on those devices, which is, obviously perhaps a greater risk to your organisation? So at least wargaming, what are those scenarios, having some policies around what people can and cannot do with their own devices. And obviously education is going to be a part of that, as I suggested right back at the start, about what your intent is and how you wish to maintain robustness and security around your organisation's data. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Durgan. That was all very interesting and gives us all a lot to think about, both professionally and personally, I think. So now I'm going to give a technical update and kind of have a few hot topics from the charity sector. So I'm going to start with the Charities Act 2022. So while not having a major impact on your day-to-day operations, the Charities Act 2022 is aimed to simplify areas of regulation, and it's supposed to provide more flexibility to trustees to manage their charities effectively. So the implementation is coming in 3 stages. The first set of changes came into force this autumn, with further amendments coming into force in spring 2023, with those final changes in the autumn of 2023. So if we just have a look at a few of those changes that are taking place. So the first change that I'm going to mention that came in this autumn was in relation to payments to trustees. My slide's different than that slide. Sorry, it's not changing. Sorry, I'll carry on anyway. In relation to payments to trustees, so charities already had the statutory power to make payments to trustees for goods and any services related to those goods. Beyond their usual trustee duties. But that power has now been extended so that it covers goods alone. So this gives the charity more opportunities where you can have more options of where to purchase items from if the trustee is able to source this at a better price for the charity. So with this, you need to ensure that, as with any payments made to trustees, that you consider whether or not this is prohibited from your governing document to make payments to your trustees, and then follow the Charity Commission guidance. It's on here now as well. It's okay, I've got my notes here. And then also follow the Charity Commission guidance. So within the Charity Commission guidance, when you're making payments to trustees, you need to consider whether or not it is in the best interests of the charity. So it needs to be justified that those payments are going to the trustees and not to a third party. You need to ensure that the conflict of interest is managed. So the trustee who is receiving that payment should not be involved in that decision-making process. And finally, you need to make sure there's a record. So the ideal place to make this decision would be within a trustee meeting, which is minuted. So the next one that I will mention is in relation to, hang on, I've turned too many pages now. So is ex gratia payments. So this change has actually been postponed. So this was due to come in this autumn, and the plan was that charities were going to be given the power to waive their right to receive funds where it was understood there was a moral obligation to do so. So this was planned to cover where you might receive a legacy, but it's clear that since that will was written, that the donor would have changed their mind, and therefore the charity for small amounts was going to be able to waive their right to the funds or return them back to the donor. And this would have been without Charity Commission approval. The House of Lords, however, have postponed this, and it's indefinite at the moment. It's under further consideration because they hadn't considered the impact this could have upon museums, and in particular national museums, because this could, they want to fully understand the implications, because it could cause people, these museums, to feel that they need to restitute items from their collections back to original owners or original countries. So this wasn't the intended purpose of this section, and therefore, and it wasn't debated, so it's on hold until they can have a bit more clarification on what this would mean. Okay, so the next one I'll mention, which has come into implementation, is in relation to fundraising appeals and where you are raising funds for restricted donations. So, it's working now. Let me just catch up. Here we go. We're back up. So, where are we raising funds for restricted purposes? So if you have a fundraising appeal, you could potentially raise more than you need for that project. Not enough, so your project can't go ahead. Or there could be a change in circumstances, so you choose not to go ahead. So there is now increased flexibility to be able to reapply these funds for different purposes. So the first thing to consider is the wording of your appeal. If you did have a secondary purpose in your appeal, for if these funds weren't needed for that fund, those funds can be reapplied without Charity Commission approval. You then would still need to, after this, you would then need to consider whether or not any of those donations could be returned to those original donors. They can be offered back to them, and they may well say, no, you can keep them. But if there's an unreasonable expense to do so, or it's impossible to identify those donors, then you can consider reapplying. So the new rules make it so that if you have received any restricted donations which were less than £120 from one donor, there's potential that these can be reapplied without Charity Commission approval. What you need to do is look at all of those donations which are below £120 each, and if this total amount is below £1,000, the trustees themselves can pass a resolution to reapply this restricted fund to alternative purposes. So with this, if you've got any cash collections, it's quite reasonable to assume that no one's put more than £120 in a cash tin. So as long as that whole cash collection was below £1,000, there's potential that if it was deemed necessary, the trustees can reapply. If when you look at all of these funds, they come to over £1,000, the trustees can still make a resolution to reapply to alternative purposes. However, this is not formally passed until you have received Charity Commission approval. So I've linked in the Charity Commission guidance on this, which explains the steps that you would need to take. So next spring is when the next set of changes are expected to come into force. And I'll just mention a few again. So firstly, permanent endowment funds. In relation to permanent endowment funds, most of the legal restrictions are going to remain as they are. However, there is going to be a new power to borrow from the fund. So any borrowings, there are some restrictions in play, will be restrictions in place. So any borrowings cannot exceed 25% of the value of the fund. So if you were to take multiple loans from an endowment fund, you would have to consider each time whether the total number of loans you have exceed 25%. There also would need to be arrangements in place to be able to repay, with a plan to repay the capital within 20 years of this loan. And finally, an element of capital appreciation, such as interest, should be included based on a relevant index. Another change is coming in relation to charity land. They're simplifying some of the things you have to follow when making land transactions, meaning that there's potential to use a wider choice of professional advisors. And in some circumstances, external advice from a qualified professional won't necessarily be mandatory. And it's also making it possible in some situations where you have a suitably qualified trustee or employee, you may be able to use their advice rather than external advice. The last one I'll mention that's coming in the spring is the Charity Commission already had the power to direct a charity to change its legal name where it was deemed to be too similar to another charity. It's now extended that power so that if it has a working name, it can also be directed to change that one also. And so the last set of changes from the Act is coming in the autumn of 2023, and those include some increased consistency in how charity constitutions and when you apply to change your purposes of the things that would be considered. So they're changing it so that it's consistent, whether you're an unincorporated, incorporated, or CIO, that the same points will be considered. So those points that will now be, from the autumn that will be considered, would be the original purposes of the charity, the desirability of the purposes to be similar to the original ones, and this is a new one that wasn't included before, is the need for the purposes to be suitable and effective in light of the current social and economic circumstances, which I think is a great addition because actually if you have a historic charity that's been around, some of our clients have been around for over 100 years, then the economic and social environment that they are working is completely different. So it may be necessary to change your objectives so that, or change your objects to make sure that you are still impacting the required beneficiaries. There is also some changes made to, or changes coming in relation to when you incorporate from an unincorporated to a CIO. There's some changes to make it that might make it easier and potentially removes the need to keep open a shell charity to capture legacies. And lastly, the 2022 Act, rather than being a whole new Act in itself, is actually an amendment to the 2011 Act, and therefore your statutory accounts will continue to refer to the 2011 Act going forwards. So moving on, earlier this year, the Charity Commission held an open consultation into the annual return. So they say that this was a key step to become a more data-driven regulator. And it's the first major review has taken place since our current annual return that came out in 2018. So on the annual return, the Chief Executive of the Charity Commission said that the annual return is a crucial tool to help charities account for their work. And it's important we get the questions right, but also keep the burden on charities for completing the return proportionate. So it's positive to hear this, that they don't want to be increasing the burden on you. But I'm going to have a look at some of the details so you can see whether or not that is really going to happen. So I came up with a different figure here than Lexi did this morning. That I came up with, there's 170,000 UK registered charities, so you can find a statistic for anything. But of those 170,000 UK charities, how many responses do you think the Charity Commission got to the consultation? Any guesses? Pardon? 10%. 10%. Nowhere near. There were 460 responses, which is less than 0.5%. So I've made the assumption that most of you haven't seen the changes that have been proposed, so I'm going to just run through some of those. So currently the annual return is in 4 parts. You have the basic questions for charities with income over 10,000. Then you have the more detailed questions for those with income over 500,000. And then the third and fourth parts, for most of you, will be combined because that is your trustees' report and your financial statements. So that is expected to stay the same. The proposed changes is that they're going to have a greater number of questions. So I've had a look at the number of questions. So currently there are 36 is the maximum number of questions, of which 16 are core questions. The proposal is that there will be 52 maximum questions, but the core questions are increasing to 32, so that is double the number of questions. So I don't think they are meeting their, reducing the burden. They are saying, though, that they are going to simplify and clarify these questions, and there will be an interactive glossary, which I think would be a great tool because a lot of the questions in the return currently use a lot of jargon and are quite misleading and difficult to answer if you are not a finance professional. And another interesting point is they're looking to have the ability to change the questions. So the questions in your annual return are set by the regulations, so the Charity Commission is unable to change these questions year on year. And so, but they want to be able to, and this is as a response to the pandemic. So during the pandemic, they would have liked to have had a lot more information from you as charities to see how you were coping, but they couldn't use the annual return as a tool to do that. So what they're proposing is to have a question that won't be included every year, but it's a major external change question. And this question would be included following a risk assessment that they undertake. And so if they felt that it was necessary, they would include this one additional question. This additional question, though, it covers, it wanted to know how this major external change affected your income, the number of employees, the number of volunteers. I can't say all on here. Oh yes, so impact on donations, fundraising, other income, expenditure, number of volunteers, number of employees, number of trustees, and the total service demand. So while this is one additional question, it's quite a lot of information that they're looking for, and you may not have prepared for this if you don't know the question. Yeah. So both the ICAEW and the Directory for Social Change have questioned this in their responses, and they both feel that it needs to be justified whether or not this is included, both from the having the information prospect and to the cost benefit of including it. So even if you haven't had a chance to respond, at least they have for you. So some of the additional questions I've had a look at, and I've just pulled out a few of what they're looking for. They're looking for more information on reliance on certain sources of income. And most of these are going to be yes or no questions from the plans, but things like, is 70% or more from one funding source, or is 25% or more from corporate donations? So while these are yes or no, this will involve needing to analyse your income, break it all down and calculate those percentages. So from my perspective, I think this actually is a lot of extra work. Following on from the change to the Charities Act, they're looking to use the annual return as a tool to find out more about trustee payments. So they're having plans to include questions which will ask about those goods, services and remuneration that has been paid to the trustees. They're planning extra questions on roles and responsibilities. In relation to overseas partners, they're planning a specific question that asks whether you have a written agreement with your overseas partners, because it is best practice to do so. In relation to the geographical areas you operate, this is aimed at the national charities. They want to know, at the moment they already ask you which areas locally you work in, so which counties and things, but they want to know specifically the postcodes you are working out of, and the idea is to be able to identify areas of the country which are underserved. With website hosting, they want to know which country your website is hosted in as part of their plans, because of the risk of cybersecurity. And then they're planning extra questions in relation to trading subsidiaries, and in particular where you have shared trustees and directors. They want to know, so I'm guessing to be able to assess whether there is some independence there. And the last one shouldn't be too much of a burden, but because this is in your financial statements, but it's pulling it into a more accessible place, is in relation to staffing numbers and payroll costs. So looking at these extra questions, I had a look, and so the ones that they are planning to publish, if these questions come in, on your charity information page on the Charity Commission website are the trustee payments, the areas you operate, the trading subsidiaries, and those staffing costs, because they feel that this is information that would be relevant to the funders. So I had a look, and they also, as part of the consultation, it showed how much time they think it takes you to complete your annual return, and this is before the changes. So I think for the smallest ones, it's probably about right, where you only have 1 or 2 questions of the basic information, half an hour. I thought it was quite, so once you get up to £25,000 to £250,000, it's saying it takes a whole day to collate that information and submit the return. I thought it was quite interesting that there's no distinction above £250,000, because at that point they think it takes 30 hours plus half a day senior leadership time. It's particularly interesting because at £500,000, you get a whole extra questionnaire in there, and they haven't increased the time there. So how much extra time do they think you're going to take to do the return? 10 to 50%. And with this, the 10% extra they actually specifically noted is in relation to the small charities. So if you're a larger charity, if you've got 50% extra time, that's over a week's worth of time to collate that information for your annual return. So they may not have been planning to increase the burden, but I personally think that they will be. So at the moment, they are collating the responses from the consultation, which will be, and those will be published towards the end of this year. The new form will be launched at the beginning of 2023, and that will affect periods from the 1st of January 2023. So I would recommend that you keep your eye out to see what extra information that is going to be requested, because if they do go with all of these questions, you might want to start collating it through the year rather than having to do this all at the end of the year. So the next topic I'm going to look at, this is going to be quite a heavy topic. This is VAT. VAT for business or non-business, so where charity's income is vatable or not vatable. So although charities are may not be deemed to have any business activities under other laws, the definition of a business activity for VAT is based in specific VAT law and on VAT tribunal and High Court case decisions. And so the result is that an activity that is performed for the benefit of the community or for the furtherance of your charitable aims and objectives, it can be deemed to be a business activity for VAT. So earlier this year, HMRC issued a new brief which changed their policy of how you should determine whether or not your activities are business activities. And this doesn't just cover charities. This is for all organisations who are in receipt of grant funding, subsidies, or have non-business activities. So if we start by looking at the old test, I'm not going to read through all the questions, but the basic idea was you have the 6 questions. If you could answer no to one, you could start to argue that it was a non-business activity. And the one that charities could use the most was question 5. Is the activity predominantly concerned with the making of taxable supplies to consumers for consideration? Well, charities were able to argue quite well that their predominant activity was to fulfil their charitable objects, and any commercial aim was therefore secondary and not the predominant concern. And so they have in the past been able to successfully argue that their activities were non-business activities. So the Court of Appeal have now ruled that the predominant concern question is irrelevant. So they now think we should be focusing on whether there is a direct link between the services provided and the payments received, rather than the wider context of the charitable objects or motive. So as a result, HMRC will no longer apply the previous business test. There is a new 2-stage test. And the aim is to ensure that your objectives can no longer trump a business motive behind an activity. So if we have a look at the new test, so with this, if you have multiple activities, each of your activities should be considered separately. And then stage 1 of the test is to consider if the activity results in a supply of goods or services for consideration. An activity that does not involve the making of supplies for consideration can't be deemed a business activity for VAT. This requires there to be a legal relationship between the supplier and the recipient. And where there is a direct link, it could be regarded as economic and potentially battable. So the court made a distinction between consideration, which is a payment made, and remuneration, which is a payment made for something, which leads you to stage 2, and whether or not the supply is made for the purpose of obtaining that income, which they then say is remuneration. And is that a direct or sufficient link between the supplies made and the payments? I know this is all really confusing, but please bear with me. So the idea behind this is that a consideration could be paid when there's no business activity. An example of this could be a peppercorn rent. So you might pay £1 rent a year where there's no intention for that money to remunerate for the rental, but the payment was made in order to have a legally binding agreement. So that activity itself would then not be a business activity. The further confusing point is the activity, if it's carried out for the purpose of obtaining income, it's a business activity even if it is charged at below cost. But I think, again, in relation to that peppercorn rent, it's the distinction between how far below cost that is. So confusingly, HMRC say that the previous test, the Fisher test, can still be used as a set of tools to help you answering the new questions. But each indicator can no longer override the direct link requirement. And they say that when you're considering business activities, it's not relevant at all whether or not the supplier is a charity. There is a lot of guidance that HMRC have published with specific information about a wide range of income sources for charities and how to identify whether they would be business or non-business, so battable or not battable. So I've linked that one in here, which you may be interested in. And I have also linked in the new guidance in relation to how to answer this two-stage test. So these parts are all just parts, this is all just parts of the puzzle because this brief HMRC issue does not bind HMRC. So you still need to make sure that you still need to make sure that you're considering in each instance all of the most recent cases that have taken place before taking a view on whether or not it's a business activity. VAT is a very, very complex area. So if you have got any doubts about the VAT position of your organisation, please do seek advice. Something a little bit lighter now, a bit easier, is the Charity Commission have announced that they are launching a new My Charity Commission account, which is an online service. So this is aimed at trustees, charity contacts and professional advisors. This is part of their aims to build a more supportive and meaningful relationship with individual trustees. So the services that will be included are similar to those that you already have on the current online account, which is updating details, submitting annual returns, and making changes to governing documents, name, year end. What they're looking to add in is tailored support and information specifically relating to your charity. So when you look at what the annual return questions are going to be, where they're having lots of questions around best practice, my thoughts are they going to link this back to the support that they directly link into your account? But we'll wait and see whether that is it. So with the new accounts, the implementation is starting now, from now until March. To start with, if you are the main contact on your existing online account, you might start to be contacted to make sure that you have everything set up correctly, ready for the transition. A few people will be contacted to invite them to trial the new system. And then from the spring, the new online accounts will go live. And so these main contacts will have the ability then to enable trustees and other third parties to set up their own accounts. And then all of the new services should become available at that point. So if we look at the 3 types of account that are planned, so the administrator account, which is currently your main contact, will have full access to all of the online services, be able to amend personal information. But interestingly, when I was reading this, it said not for trustees. And they also will be able to enable other users. And then, so there's trustee accounts. Within the information there, it says that they would be able to maintain their own personal details. So from reading the information, it looks like they are aiming for each trustee to have their own online account to manage their own details. What they are doing is then for individual trustees is where you're a trustee of more than one charity, they want your account to be personal to you. So if you log in, you'll be able to view all of the charities to which you are a trustee for in one place. So thereby, if you update your personal information for one charity, it updates it for all of them. So what the guidance is saying is at the moment, continue using your account as you are, but if you are using a generic email address such as info@your organisation for your contact account and as your trustee contacts, that you should start to change these across to individual email addresses to make implementation easier. And then, so the third-party accounts, they're completely controlled by the administrator of your charity. So the access and rights that they would have, so as professional advisors that we could have, would be completely controlled by the charity. The last point that they have also suggested is where you have administrator accounts, you have more than one account set as an administrator, because this can make it easier should there be changes in circumstances. And the last thing I will just mention briefly is in relation to the Code of Fundraising Practice. So this is the set of standards that apply when fundraising is carried out in the UK, and this covers all charities and their fundraising partners, so any third-party organisations or online fundraising platforms that you use. So this is currently under review, and the fundraising regulator is looking to gain feedback from all stakeholders, so that's the fundraisers and the donors, for what they want to see from the Code of Practice. So the phase 1 of information gathering, this actually closed on Friday, but there is a second public consultation coming in the autumn of 2023. So if you do want to have a say on the fundraising regulator's Code of Practice, keep an eye out on the fundraising regulator's website and you'll be able to respond to their second public consultation later next year. And then the new code is planned to be implemented in 2024. And so that brings us to the end. I think we will take questions if anyone has any questions.
Sorry, I might try and I'll stand over here so we don't feedback against each other. Although that side, I might not be in the video thing. But firstly then, just a thank you to Durgan and to Sarah for your presentations, both incredibly insightful. I won't make the link between talking about cybersecurity and then the IT going down. but yeah, thank you for that. And I think sorry, there's a little bit of feedback, isn't there? Maybe, yeah. And then from Sarah's perspective, just to pick up on the VAT side of things, because it is something that we see quite a lot. There is that assumption on behalf of charitable organisations that they are wholly exempt from tax and that VAT is not relevant. And actually we do see this quite a lot. If you're getting a grant and in return for that grant you're providing something, then there's a link there between a service and receiving for that. And that can therefore bring you then into the scope of VAT. So it is something to be aware of, and as Sarah's mentioned, the rules have just got a lot more complicated around that. So I think the short story there would just be to take advice if you think you fall within that section. I'm conscious that it's coming up to 12:30 and that lunch has been served at the back as well, but Sarah and I and all of the team, in fact, will hang around over lunch, so by all means ask us any questions whilst we're here. Are there any burning questions before we sign off for today? Lovely. All right, well, I will leave it there then so we finish exactly on time. Thank you all very much for joining us. Do hang around for some lunch if you've got time. And we will circulate the slides as well, which have got links to the various guidance and things that we've referred to today as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and my thanks again to our speakers this morning. Thank you, everyone.